Good evening. My name is Jonathan, and I want to share the experience I had when I visited Mexico City. I spent most of my time traveling around the city by metro to explore it. I went there as a backpacker, and that city was my first destination. I'm from Honduras, and I've always dreamed of visiting this beautiful country, but my family didn't have the resources for that kind of trip. I was 21 when this happened, and now I'm 29. The first few days I was there, I met two guys at the hostel where I was staying. They were from Colombia, and we talked about many things. But for this story, the important part was that they told me about some strange experiences they'd had in the metro of the city. They shared this with me as a warning, advising me to be careful and avoid traveling alone at night, especially since I was on my own. They told me that 2 nights before, they were returning from a bar very late at night and took the metro back to the hostel. They said the station was nearly empty, with only a few minutes left until it closed, as a security guard had informed them. They were waiting for the last train, standing near the tracks, when they noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench, also waiting for the metro. Suddenly, from the opposite side of the tracks, which was also empty, they saw a man appear out of nowhere. He jumped onto the tracks, but instead of hitting the ground, he vanished. They described it as if in the blink of an eye, the man had simply disappeared, which left them both stunned and unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Out of nowhere, the elderly man who was sitting told them, "Do not be afraid of what you just saw, for they feed off your fear. They are souls who, having taken their own lives at this place, cannot transcend and are trapped here." They didn't respond to him, but the old man's words left an unsettling impression on them. They couldn't shake the fear they were feeling because who wouldn't be terrified after seeing something like that? I thanked them for the warning, but to be honest, I was a little skeptical. I couldn't fully believe them. After all, only those who have had paranormal experiences or seen strange things can truly relate, like me. After what happened to me on that same metro, though, I started to reconsider. The next day I spent my time sightseeing around the city, visiting museums and the most popular tourist spots, as well as tasting the incredible Mexican food. But before I knew it, it was nearly 11 p.m., and I was far from my hostel. I hurried to the nearest metro station, but when I saw how desolate everything was, I remembered the story the guys had shared, and I started to feel afraid. I don't know if what happened to me was the result of my own fear, or if it was simply fate, but as I walked down the long corridor to the platforms, I began to feel like someone was following me. I thought it was just my nerves, but when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw a man walking just a few steps behind me, matching my pace. That's when things took a darker turn. This man had no eyes or nose, and his face was covered in scars. I quickly turned my head back around, my heart racing and my palms sweating. My face must have shown my terror, but the few people around didn't seem to notice anything strange, even though they were all looking at me. They never turned to look at the man following me. It was as if they couldn't see him. Only I could. I made it to the tracks where a few people were waiting, but the place felt eerily empty and heavy, with a strange sense of loneliness. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. When the metro finally arrived, I got on immediately, hoping that the nightmare was over. I sat next to a woman, and I began to calm down. But when we arrived at the next station, the metro stopped and many people got off, leaving the car nearly empty. The woman next to me stayed seated even though it was my stop. At the next stop, nearly everyone else got off, and an older man boarded. I didn't pay much attention to him at first because his head was down, but then the woman suddenly gathered her things and whispered to me, "Get off at the next stop. Leave as quickly as possible before the doors close." I didn't react in time, and before I knew it, the door shut and I saw the woman staring at me through the window, looking worried. The metro moved forward with only me and the man who had just boarded. My heart was pounding, but I dared to look up, and there he was, the man without a face, covered in scars, sitting right across from me. My body was frozen with fear, and I quickly looked away, squeezing my eyes shut. For the next 2 minutes I kept praying, my heart racing until we reached the next stop. I opened my eyes to find that the man was gone, and other people had boarded the train. I rushed to my destination, ran straight to my room, and locked the door behind me. I felt safe there, but the terror stayed with me. For a moment I thought about going back to my country, but after talking with my family, they convinced me not to abandon my travel dreams. They just advised me to avoid the metro at night, which I did. Honestly, I never took it again during my entire stay. I'll never know who that man was, or if anyone else has seen him at that station. I don't know his tragic story or how he met his end, but that experience marked me for life. To this day, I still have nightmares, not the peaceful kind, but terrifying ones, I just felt compelled to share this story with you. And remember, always be careful about what you think, because you may just bring it into reality. Washington, D.C. during a typical morning as I was heading to work. I was still feeling a bit drowsy, but what was about to happen would completely wake me up. At the next stop, after I had gotten on, an elderly woman, probably around 70 years old, entered. She had a large hunchback and a black shawl covering her head. Since the metro was packed, there were no seats available for her. However, a young man who was seated in the designated area for elderly or disabled passengers stood up and offered her his seat. He said, "Ma'am, please take my seat if you'd like." The woman glared at him with a face full of anger, almost as if she were insulted. Her eyes seemed like they would pop out of her head from how furious she looked. She replied, "I didn't ask for your seat. I'm not some old cripple." The young man was surprised, quickly apologized, and sat back down. But then a young woman sitting beside him spoke up and said, "A simple thank you would have been enough, ma'am. There's no need to be so rude." The elderly woman turned toward her with a look of rage I'd never seen in my life. The old woman snapped, "What did you say?" But the young woman didn't answer. She just turned away, clearly ignoring her. Then, to everyone's shock, the old woman started speaking in a language that no one understood, words that were foreign and strange, and she didn't stop staring at the young woman who had confronted her. The young woman was visibly confused, but the elderly lady kept chanting these strange words, her eyes burning with anger and hatred. I arrived at my stop and got off the metro, but coincidentally the young woman also got off at the same station. We both exited the metro almost simultaneously. I was standing on the sidewalk, waiting for the bus that would take me to work, when I saw the young woman crossing the street. Out of nowhere, a car sped down the road and struck her. All of us who were standing there froze, as none of us saw where the car came from. The driver didn't even stop and fled the scene. After a moment, I regained my senses and saw that people were rushing to help the young woman. A nurse who happened to be passing by stopped to assist, but after checking, she confirmed that the woman had no pulse. She had died instantly, and no one knew who had hit her or where the car had come from. Some might say it was a coincidence, but I can't shake the feeling that what happened to her was somehow connected to the old woman and the strange words she had said to her. Maybe the old woman had cursed her, wishing something bad would happen. The way she looked and the words she spoke made it seem like she could have been a witch or something of that nature. Of course, I'll never know for sure, but I'm almost 100% convinced that's what happened. The lesson here is simple. Never insult anyone in public. And honestly, never insult anyone, anywhere. We never know who we are dealing with, especially in places crowded with people. Always remember that the world is full of evil. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. Hello everyone, my name is Jesus, and I want to share something that happened to me on the Los Angeles Metro. I've been living here for years, and at the beginning, the metro and the bus were my primary modes of transportation since I couldn't afford a car yet. I would go back and forth to my job, transferring between different metro lines throughout the city. I used to finish work at 10:30 p.m. as I worked as a waiter at a restaurant, and sometimes I was tasked with closing. That meant I often arrived at the station close to 11 at night. Nothing unusual had ever happened to me before, at least nothing out of the ordinary for this city. There are many people here without homes, and they tend to use the metro to protect themselves from the cold until the stations close, sometimes causing trouble. Many of them are also under the influence of substances. But what happened that night far surpassed anything I had ever encountered. That night, I was the one to close the restaurant. I walked to the station and entered as usual. There weren't many people, and when the train arrived, I noticed there were only 3 other people besides me. I sat down, waiting for the metro to start moving when a woman entered with a baby wrapped in a blanket in her arms. As soon as the doors closed and the train started moving, we all had the same unpleasant expression on our faces. When that woman got on, the whole car started filling with an awful putrid smell. It wasn't the typical smell of someone living on the streets who can't bathe. It was worse, almost as if something was rotting, unbearable. The people around me tried to cover their noses with their hands or jackets, but the woman just stared at us, one by one. She looked extremely pale, and her clothes were very worn, but the most concerning thing was that she had a baby in her arms, or so it seemed. The woman was standing, holding the pole with one hand, while her other arm cradled the child. After a while, she chose to sit next to another lady, and as soon as she did, that lady started screaming in terror, and ran towards the rest of us. She kept shouting, "This woman has a lifeless baby!" A man stood up to approach her and check the situation. The woman sitting there showed no expression, not even when the lady screamed. She didn't try to cover the baby, she just let the man come closer. He checked the baby, and from the look on his face, he confirmed the worst. He moved away from her, and the young man sitting nearby asked him what had happened. The man explained, and the young guy immediately looked terrified. He took out his phone and called the police to report the woman. But suddenly, and out of nowhere, while the metro was moving and we were still under a tunnel, the woman placed the baby's body on the seat and with unbelievable strength opened the back doors of the train. She jumped onto the tracks. The alarm in the metro started ringing and the driver began slowing down. I sat there in complete shock, unable to process what was happening. It felt unreal. I had just witnessed someone taking their own life, leaving a decaying baby's body behind in the seat. We reached the next station, where police officers were already waiting. They evacuated everyone from the train except us, as they needed to take our statements. While each of us explained what had happened, other officers searched the tunnel for the woman's body. It was impossible that she had survived. The train was moving too fast. If she were alive, she would have been badly injured, but they found nothing. They searched the tracks with flashlights and even used a police dog, but no signs of anyone were found. The officers returned to take more statements from us, as we were all considered suspects. After all, there was a dead child in a state of decomposition on the train. It was a tough situation for me, especially since I had just been granted residency in this country, and now I was a suspect, just like the other 3 people who had been with me. We were detained for the entire night, until one of the officers told me I could leave. Apparently, they had reviewed the station's security footage, and they saw the woman entering the train with the baby. However, they couldn't find any footage of her leaving the tunnel. She simply disappeared inside. If she had survived, she had to have been somewhere, but she was never seen exiting on any of the cameras. I never heard anything more about the case. I don't know who that poor baby was, or who the strange woman was, or what happened to her. But I did know that they were never able to find her. There were many theories circulating that the woman was already dead, but had wanted to leave her baby in a safe place so that she could transcend. I know my story is intense, but I wanted to share it with all of you. I've always had this doubt about what really happened. I would love to hear your thoughts on it, as the police could never solve the case. Hello, my name is Taddeo. I'm 25 years old, and this happened to me last year when I was riding the metro in Los Angeles. It was, of course, a paranormal experience, and it truly scared me, leaving me with no explanation. You see, I get off work at 10 p.m. I work as a manager in a restaurant, and I'm usually the one to close. This means I have to take the metro very late at night, although it's no secret that strange things happen on the metro, especially at night or early in the morning. Nothing paranormal had ever happened to me before. The worst thing that had occurred was once having my wallet stolen, but that's a different story. As usual, I closed the restaurant and walked to the station, which is only about 2 blocks away from my workplace. When I arrived, the station was almost empty, which is typical for that time of night. The atmosphere can feel a little strange and tense when there's not much activity, but I had gotten used to it. Finally, the metro arrived. I got on and sat by the window as I usually do. While I was getting on, I was distracted looking for my headphones in my bag because I love relaxing to music on my way home after a long day at work. In the end, I never found them, realizing I had left them on the counter while counting the cash at the register. So I had no choice but to endure the sound of the train, which, to be honest, I find very annoying. When I looked up, I noticed that the train was almost empty. There were only 2 women sitting at the other end of the car. I didn't know who else was behind me because I didn't turn around to check. I was so tired, and I just leaned back against the glass and started scrolling through my social media. As the metro moved forward, I suddenly heard a man talking to what seemed to be his son. It was a small child's voice. I remember the man telling the child something like, "You behaved very badly today. I told you to stay where I left you, but you went off and did mischief. You scared Mari and they almost kicked me out of the restaurant." I distinctly heard the child reply with a mocking laugh, saying, "I don't like Mari. I'm going to make her disappear." I was so shocked I opened my eyes wide. I couldn't believe a child was saying things like that. I stayed quiet, trying to hear what the man would say in response. He simply said, "I didn't summon you for that." I couldn't help but look out the window, where I could see a reflection of the man's face as he looked at the child. The child was barely visible in the reflection, but I could see the outline of his head. The child kept speaking in a low voice, and I just stared at the man in the reflection, watching him closely as he leaned in to hear what the child was whispering. But then, I saw the man turn to look at me through the reflection. It was as if the child had told him I was listening to their conversation. I quickly turned my head back toward the front, pretending I hadn't heard anything, but this man kept staring at me throughout the rest of the journey. At the next stop, I was stunned when I saw that what he had been carrying wasn't a child at all. It was a doll, a large puppet. I could see it clearly now. As the man walked toward the front of the car, the puppet seemed to be looking at me as it hung in the man's arms. More people got on, and I lost track of the man and his puppet. I turned around to check if any children had boarded, but there was absolutely no one there. The man had been talking to his puppet, and I could hear the voice of the child, a disturbing voice that sounded almost demonic, an innocent-sounding voice, but very unsettling. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Trying to find a logical explanation, I thought maybe the man was doing the child's voice, but that didn't make sense. I had been watching him in the reflection, and his lips weren't moving when the so-called child spoke. What was even more disturbing was what the puppet had said about making someone named Mari disappear because it didn't like her. That left me deeply worried, but I couldn't do much about it since I didn't even know who the man was or what his name was. I just hope that Mari is okay, wherever she is. That's the story of my experience on the cold subway trains for the first time. It was a reality that many people talk about, but until you experience it yourself, you can't truly believe it. My name is Joel Ramos, and I want to share with you an experience that happened to me almost a year ago in the subway of Chicago. I don't live in that city, but I was sent there for a few days for work. They told me that the easiest and quickest way to get around was by taking the subway. Since it was my first time in that city, I wasn't familiar with the traffic. I remember it was my second day there, and I finished work around 9 p.m. I went down to the station to catch the subway when I noticed a man standing across the tracks from me. He was wearing a very elegant suit, but what caught my attention wasn't his outfit. It was the fact that he was smiling at me. I was almost certain he was looking directly at me, so I just smiled back politely. I then looked down at my phone to check some messages, but I still felt like his eyes were on me. I looked back up again, and he was still standing there, smiling. Honestly, at first I didn't think much of it, and I didn't feel uncomfortable either. I had been warned that in that city, I might encounter all kinds of people. I thought maybe he was just drunk or had taken something, so I decided to move a little farther down the platform to avoid facing him directly. But at that moment, the subway arrived. I brushed off the weird feeling and quickly got on, hoping to sit down since I was so tired. But when I turned around, I saw that the same man had also boarded and was sitting at the back of the train. I never figured out how he got on, since he had been on the opposite side of the tracks. He was sitting in the last seat, still smiling. But I noticed he wasn't looking at me anymore. His eyes were distant, almost vacant. That made it even more unsettling. His eyes were wide open, and it looked as if he was trying too hard to keep them open, almost in an unnatural way. It was terrifying. I was starting to panic, wanting nothing more than to get to my stop and get off that train. As the train made more stops, fewer people remained in the car, and I didn't want to be alone with that man. Eventually only a couple and I were left, plus the smiling man. At that point, I decided that if the couple got off at the next stop, I would get off too, even though I still had 3 more stops to go. As it turned out, the couple got off 1 stop earlier than mine, so I followed them off the train. When I looked back at the subway car, the smiling man was nowhere to be seen. I didn't see him get off, and I looked around, but he wasn't anywhere. I felt a huge sense of relief and decided to wait for the next train to finally reach my destination. I didn't want to walk because I knew the streets were dangerous at that hour, so I stayed put and waited. By then, only a security guard and the cleaning staff were left in the station. I was starting to get really anxious, feeling a very bad vibe about the whole situation when suddenly I saw him again. The same man was standing across the tracks, grinning with that creepy, empty look in his eyes, but this time he started moving strangely. His arms and legs were moving in unnatural ways, as if he had no bones. It's hard to explain, but it was the most disturbing thing I had ever seen. I quickly turned my head away, not wanting to look at him. When my train finally arrived, I got on, and there was just an older woman and me. I made sure to sit as far away from her as possible. I was just hoping to reach my stop, trying to relax a little when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the woman sit next to me. She leaned in and whispered, "Don't turn around, but there's a man behind us. He's staring at us and smiling, and it really freaks me out." What she said made my blood run cold. I slowly turned my head and saw him, now much closer to me. He wasn't far away anymore, but sitting just 2 seats behind me. This time I could see him more clearly. His eyes were wide, his smile growing bigger, and his movements were even more disturbing. I turned to the woman and asked if she had seen him get on, but she replied that she hadn't. She had been checking messages from her grandson and had thought he must have gotten on when I did. I told her I hadn't seen him either. When we finally reached my stop, the woman got off with me and we both watched as the man slowly disappeared into the train. She told me to be careful, saying that she was used to this kind of thing since she took the subway almost every day. She thanked me for keeping her company and then left. I quickly made my way to my hotel, which was just a block from the station. I was staying on the 2nd floor and rushed up, feeling such relief to be in a safe place, finally ready to forget that disturbing experience. Hours passed and I fell asleep, but I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. sweating and feeling anxious. I got up to go to the bathroom, and just before I entered, I looked out the big window facing the street. And there he was, standing right outside, grinning and moving in that eerie, unnatural way. I quickly shut the blinds and called my girlfriend, trying to calm down. I was terrified. When I went back to bed, he was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being paranoid. So I called my company and asked to be moved to a different hotel. I told them I felt uncomfortable with the atmosphere and made up some story about dangerous tenants, not going into any more detail. Thankfully, they agreed to change my hotel. The next day, I didn't sleep at all. I was still shaken, convinced that the man had followed me to my hotel. After that, I never took the subway again, and I never saw that man, or whatever he was, again. Since that day, I've started to believe in the supernatural and respect it. When something like that happens to you, there's no going back. It leaves a mark, and the fear it leaves behind is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. And those were today's stories. Have you ever heard any stories similar to the ones told today? Let me know in the comments which of the 5 stories caught your attention the most. If you liked it, don't forget to like and get ready, because in the next video, I'll bring more disturbing stories.